I watched my boyfriend of 3 years fall for my sister because my mother convinced him she was stronger, better, more ambitious. I left everything behind, heartbroken and alone, moving to a city where nobody knew my name. Years later, at a grand party I threw, they saw me, not as the girl they underestimated, but as a woman who had built a life of success, power, and undeniable presence. The same people who tried to write my story for me had no idea I was the author all along. Rain hammered the Philadelphia streets, turning neon signs into streaks of blurred light, the kind that makes everything feel like a memory you're already losing. Audrey pressed her forehead against the cool glass of her apartment window, watching the drops race each other down the pane. Her phone buzzed on the countertop, a message from Mark, running late. "Be right back." She didn't reply. She shouldn't have come to the graduation party. She knew it. Her mother's voice still echoed in her mind, sharp and casual, like she was naming ingredients in a recipe rather than condemning her heart. "Audrey, Elizabeth is stronger. She's better for him." Audrey had frozen that night outside the kitchen door, peeking through a crack, drinking in the betrayal that didn't just involve Mark, but her mother, her own blood. Her heart had snapped quietly, unnoticed by anyone but herself. Now, the memory cut deeper than the rain lashing the streets. The party had been ordinary on the surface, champagne flutes clinking, laughter bouncing against the walls, but Audrey had seen the undercurrent. Her mother steering Mark's gaze toward Elizabeth with practiced ease, her sister leaning in like it was natural, inevitable. Audrey had smiled through the evening, pretending not to hear the sentences that would echo for years. "You deserve someone who pushes you forward. Elizabeth just made junior partner. What do you have to show for your art degree?" She hadn't cried in front of them. She had backed away silently, carrying a hollow ache that felt heavier than any physical burden. That night, she had packed the bare essentials into her car, a small apartment of second-hand furniture, her meager savings, and a portfolio of unfinished sketches, and driven straight into the storm. Years later, Audrey still remembered the weight of that betrayal like a second skin. Chicago had been a lifeline, a place where nobody knew her name, nobody knew what she'd lost or how she'd been replaced. She'd built herself from scratch in a city that didn't care who she was yesterday, only who she would be tomorrow. In this quiet apartment, with the rain drumming a relentless rhythm, Audrey allowed herself the briefest exhale of relief. She had survived Mark, Elizabeth, her mother, but more than that, she had built a life they could never touch. The city lights reflected on her workspace, illuminating sketches and spreadsheets side by side, art and strategy intertwined, proof of a woman who refused to be defined by betrayal. A knock at the door made her start. It was mundane, her neighbor dropping off a package, but even that startled her. She smiled faintly, realizing how far she'd come from that paralyzed girl peeking through a door. Audrey opened the door, retrieved her mail, and let the moment sink in. She was here, she was seen, and this life was hers alone. Yet beneath the calm, a flicker of tension lingered. The past never fully lets go. Faces, voices, and choices she'd once thought buried still hovered in the corners of her mind. Audrey shook it off, setting her mail aside and rolling up her sleeves. She had work to do. Big work. Life-changing work. Outside, the rain began to ease. The city lights shimmered against wet asphalt, an unspoken promise. The storm had passed, and the horizon was hers to shape. The first weeks in Chicago felt like walking through fog, uncertain, cold, but electrifying with possibility. Audrey lugged boxes into a modest studio apartment whose peeling paint and humming radiator contrasted sharply with the visions she carried in her head. A life rebuilt, a story rewritten. She wandered the streets with sketchbook under arm, studying the sharp angles of the skyline, the cracks in the sidewalks, the determined faces of strangers hustling past, thinking how each of them, in some way, was fighting to be seen. Jobs came and went like fleeting shadows, interviews where her resume felt like a confession of inadequacy, each rejection whispering reminders of her mother's cruel judgments. "You'll never match Elizabeth." But then Patrick Reynolds appeared in her orbit, tall, sharp, and unexpectedly human, the kind of man whose expectations were high but whose understanding ran deeper than most. The interview for a position at his fledgling investment firm began with polite professionalism, but ended with him leaning back, studying her with the same quiet intensity that she reserved for her canvas, and asking a question that set her pulse racing. Why start over? She had answered with honesty, a tremor of defiance in her voice, telling him that sometimes you burn the map of your old life to draw a new one, and something in his gaze shifted recognition, perhaps, or curiosity, maybe both. The work was brutal at first, long hours deciphering unfamiliar spreadsheets, learning financial jargon with a sense of wonder and anxiety in equal measure, but for the first time in years, Audrey felt her mind expanding, her capacity proving itself against challenges that no one in Philadelphia had cared to test. Patrick's trust grew gradually, the smallest nods of approval, the way he included her in meetings where her voice mattered, the way late-night takeout dinners between reports turned into conversations about dreams and regrets, ambitions and failures, where she could speak freely without fear of judgment. Yet, despite her growing confidence, the shadow of betrayal lingered in quiet moments, a news alert on her phone, a memory of Mark's hesitating glance, a flash of Elizabeth's smug smile, and she felt the tension coiling tight, not rage, not sorrow exactly, but a persistent not reminding her that the past could intrude at any time, that the people who had underestimated her still existed somewhere out there. But Chicago demanded focus. The city would not wait for her to mourn, and she refused to let it. Every morning she rose before dawn, filling her tiny kitchen with the scent of coffee and determination, sketching plans on sticky notes, memorizing spreadsheets as if they were compositions, building the scaffolding for a life no one could dismantle. Patrick's quiet confidence became her anchor. She relied on his measured words when frustration threatened to undo her, yet she refused to lean too heavily, learning instead to trust herself in ways she hadn't before. And as the weeks blurred into months, the city's gray rain-soaked streets no longer felt like obstacles, but like mirrors, reflecting a woman in motion, a woman unbroken, quietly formidable, and quietly aware that one day, those who had dismissed her might have to see exactly what she had become. Months of relentless work had begun to pay off, and Audrey was finally starting to believe she could build a life entirely on her own terms when a cold, familiar name landed in her inbox like a thunderclap. Mark Davis. At first, she hesitated, hovering over the message, a notification that he and Elizabeth were visiting Chicago for a corporate merger, seeking to meet with Patrick's firm as part of the negotiations. Her chest tightened, the pulse in her temples thundering with the echoes of old betrayal, the kitchen conversation, the apartment door, the confessions that had driven her to flee Philadelphia in a storm of heartbreak and rage. She considered deleting the email, pretending it never arrived, but the city had already taught her she could not run forever, not from her past, not from unfinished stories lurking in shadows. That night, sleep refused her. She paced her small apartment while rain splattered the windows, the city lights refracting on wet streets below, mimicking the chaos inside her. Patrick noticed her distance at breakfast, his brow furrowed, but she brushed off his concern with a practiced calm that belied the storm churning beneath. Later, she found herself standing outside the firm's new office building, the lobby gleaming with polished marble and the quiet hum of ambition, rehearsing conversations she might never want to have but somehow knew she would have to. The old feelings of inadequacy and anger clashing violently with the woman she had become, confident, capable, and unbroken. And then, the moment arrived like a cinematic collision. Mark and Elizabeth entered, laughter echoing lightly, unaware of the silent observation waiting for them. His gaze flicked momentarily toward her, a fraction of recognition, a glimmer of guilt quickly masked with corporate politeness, while Elizabeth's posture straightened, as if sensing Audrey's presence disrupted the carefully constructed facade of superiority. Audrey felt the old hurt flare, but it was different now, tempered by months of resilience, sharpened by the knowledge of her own worth, a fire she could no longer suppress. Patrick's hand found hers under the table, a silent anchor, steady and reassuring, reminding her that she no longer needed to navigate this encounter alone. The meeting began formally, presentations and projections filling the air with numbers and charts, but Audrey noticed the subtle shifts, the hesitation in Elizabeth's speech, the tension in Mark's shoulders, the way their confident smiles faltered under the weight of her composure. And then, a small, deliberate gesture, Patrick referenced an operational system Audrey had developed, a crucial insight that transformed the conversation, earning immediate praise from visiting clients, and Audrey saw it. The micro-expression of shock that crossed their faces, the realization dawning that she was no longer the lesser sibling, the replaceable girlfriend, the overlooked dreamer. It was subtle, silent, almost cinematic in its cruelty and satisfaction, and, for a moment, the old desire for vindication whispered in her mind. But she suppressed it, exhaling a quiet, controlled breath, recognizing that the victory was not in their discomfort, but in the unshakable fact that she had survived, thrived, and built something they could never take away. As the meeting concluded and the visiting party departed with polite farewells, Audrey walked through the lobby with a newfound clarity, her reflection in the glass a reminder of her evolution, a woman forged in heartbreak, sharpened by ambition, and guided not by revenge, but by the deliberate choice to claim her own life, her own success, her own narrative. And for the first time in years, the past no longer dictated her movements. She had become the author of her own story, and the city, the office, the world ahead waited for her next move. The days leading up to the gala blurred into a high-stakes symphony of preparation, each moment weighted with anticipation and unspoken tension, as Audrey meticulously curated every detail, the sustainable centerpieces, the curated lighting that softened the hall without dimming its grandeur, the carefully crafted seating chart designed to foster collaboration among clients, investors, and team members, yet her thoughts kept returning to the one table that mattered most, the one she could not control, her past. Patrick noticed the subtle tightness around her eyes, the way her fingers drummed against the invitation stack more often than the elegant glassware demanded, but whenever he asked, she brushed him off with a smile she did not fully feel. That evening, rehearsal dinners and final walkthroughs done, she found herself alone in the museum's grand hall, her reflection caught in the polished marble of the staircase, and the image of her mother, Elizabeth, and Mark flared unbidden in her mind, bringing with it the old ache of betrayal. "Audrey, you've done this before." Patrick's voice broke her reverie from the doorway, gentle but firm, but never with them watching. She forced a laugh, realizing how true it was. She had rebuilt a life without their interference, but now they were coming, and the stakes were no longer abstract. Their presence was a reminder of every fear, every slight, every whispered judgment she had carried for years. When the evening arrived, the museum sparkled with light and laughter, the sound of a string quartet threading through the cavernous halls like liquid gold, yet her pulse kept time with a different rhythm, one of anxiety and restrained fury. She watched from the entrance as her mother's practiced smile failed momentarily when their eyes met hers across the room. Elizabeth stiffened in her sequined gown, and Mark's expression flickered from surprise to a forced composure that did nothing to hide the recognition of Audrey's metamorphosis. Patrick stayed close, his hand brushing hers occasionally, a grounding presence in a storm she could feel building inside her chest. Conversation flowed around her, a curated social dance, but she noticed the subtle missteps, Elizabeth's overly formal compliments, Mark's distracted glances, the hesitation in their tone as if navigating a world they once controlled now slightly beyond their grasp. When Patrick took the stage to address the gala's attendees, speaking eloquently about sustainable ventures, corporate responsibility, and ethical growth, Audrey saw the micro-reactions from her family, surprise at her husband's charisma, unease at her proximity and involvement in his business, the dawning realization that she had carved a place in the world that was entirely her own. Afterward, during the awards presentation, she guided clients and colleagues through her operational insights, highlighting systems she had implemented to ensure growth, efficiency, and integrity, and she caught the flicker of disbelief in Elizabeth's eyes. the tight set of her mother's jaw, and Mark's momentary inability to meet her gaze. Each subtle shift, each stolen glance, carried with it a quiet triumph, yet it was tinged with an unexpected pang of compassion, a recognition that the life they had schemed to orchestrate for themselves had not yielded the perfection they imagined. Audrey realized she was standing on the precipice of closure, the final confrontation unnecessary because the proof of her transformation was visible in the room itself, in the confidence in her posture, the calm in her voice, and the partnership she shared with Patrick, a man who saw her for who she truly was. As champagne glasses clinked and the gala's energy swirled around her like a living entity, she felt the tension of the past, the weight of years of betrayal and self-doubt, begin to lift. Tonight, they would see her as she had become, not as the lesser daughter, the discarded lover, the quiet dreamer, but as a woman whose brilliance was undeniable, whose achievements were hers alone, and whose life was an unassailable declaration of resilience and self-worth. And somewhere between the music, the laughter, and the orchestrated glamour, Audrey understood that the stage was set, the climax of her journey was about to unfold, and this time, she would stand fully in the center of it, unafraid, unapologetic, and unshakable. Audrey stood at the center of the gala hall, the warm glow of chandeliers glinting off the polished surfaces, as Patrick concluded his speech and applause rippled through the crowd, but her focus was fixed, unrelenting, on the trio who had once defined her despair, her mother, Elizabeth, and Mark. Time seemed to compress, the music and chatter fading into a distant hum as she approached them, each step deliberate, measured, carrying the weight of years of betrayal, heartbreak, and painstaking reinvention. Her mother's smile faltered first, a flicker of recognition and perhaps apprehension passing across her perfectly composed face. Elizabeth's lips parted in surprise, eyes widening not with admiration, but with an uneasy awareness that the narrative they had once controlled had shifted irrevocably, and Mark's gaze, initially blank, darkened as he registered the woman before him. Not the vulnerable Audrey he had dismissed, but a force of presence and authority, radiant and undeniably complete. "I'm glad you could all attend," Audrey began, her voice calm but edged with an energy that made the trio shift slightly, instinctively closer together, a subtle shield against the confidence radiating from her. "I've waited a long time to show you something," she continued, gesturing toward the crowd of investors, clients, and colleagues whose admiration was unspoken, but evident in their attentive expressions, in the nods and smiles as they glanced toward her. "This life, this company, these achievements, they aren't because someone else chose what was best for me. They're because I chose it for myself. Every step, every challenge, every late night and sacrifice has been mine. And I build it with someone who believes in me, not someone who doubts me, manipulates me, or undermines my worth." Her mother's lips thinned, Elizabeth's jaw clenched. Mark's hands fidgeted with the cuff of his sleeve as the magnitude of Audrey's declaration sank in. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, no tearful accusations. The power lay in the undeniable truth of her presence, the sheer gravity of a life fully realized, radiating competence, resilience, and unassailable confidence. Patrick joined her side, subtly placing a hand on her lower back, grounding her as she spoke, a silent affirmation that this was a partnership built on equality, trust, and shared vision. "I don't need your approval," Audrey said softly, allowing a measured pause for each word to resonate. "I don't need your recognition. I need it only to become the person I was meant to be, and that I have done." Across the hall, murmurs of appreciation and quiet admiration rippled through the guests, and for a fleeting moment, she imagined that the room itself had shifted, tilting slightly toward her truth. Elizabeth tried to speak, but words failed, her rehearsed composure crumbling in the face of Audrey's undeniable presence. Mark's eyes darted toward the crowd, unable to find an escape from the reality he had ignored for years. Her mother's carefully cultivated facade cracked, revealing, if only for a heartbeat, the human uncertainty behind the manipulative veneer. And then Audrey smiled, not in triumph over them, not in vengeance, but in the pure, liberating clarity of self-possession. She had arrived at the apex of her own journey, and in that moment, she understood that the highest form of victory was not revenge, but recognition of her own strength, the quiet, unwavering validation that she no longer needed anyone else's permission to exist fully, powerfully, and unapologetically. Patrick leaned closer, whispering, "You're unstoppable," and she felt the final release of all the grief, rage, and doubt that had once held her hostage, replaced by an expansive calm, a radiant certainty. Audrey turned back toward the trio one last time, meeting each of their eyes evenly, not to gloat, but to convey a truth too potent to ignore. The girl they had tried to diminish had grown into a woman whose brilliance, determination, and integrity eclipsed their schemes, their manipulations, and their expectations, and nothing, not wealth, not favor, not betrayal, could diminish her again. As the gala continued around them, Audrey realized the true climax had occurred within her, a profound reclamation of identity, self-worth, and purpose that no one, not even those who had sought to define her, could ever undo. And in the quiet strength of that moment, amid the glittering lights and the hum of celebration, she finally let go of the past, fully, completely, and without regret, stepping forward into a life she had earned, shaped, and owned entirely on her own terms. The gala faded into memory like a film's final frame, the clinking glasses and soft jazz replaced by the quiet of their apartment, the city lights stretching beyond the windows like a constellation of possibilities. Audrey sank into the sofa, Patrick beside her, the warmth of his presence a steady anchor after years of turbulence. Outside, snow had begun to fall, gentle and unrelenting, blanketing the streets in quiet light, as if the world itself had paused to honor this moment of hard-won clarity. She closed her eyes and let herself breathe fully, the weight of betrayal, doubt, and years of striving dissolving into something lighter, almost luminous. The images of her mother's disapproval, Elizabeth's calculated ambition, and Mark's indecision lingered at the edges of her mind, but they no longer held power. They were shadows in a room she had long since illuminated with her own effort, talent, and courage. Patrick's hand found hers, fingers interlacing naturally, a silent testament to partnership and trust, to shared vision and unshakable belief. "We did it," he murmured softly, not in boast, but in acknowledgement of everything they had endured and created. Audrey smiled, a curve both soft and unbreakable, feeling the culmination of pain and perseverance converge into a singular, steady pulse of triumph tempered with grace. She thought of Chicago on that first rain-soaked morning, of empty motel rooms and the precarious hope that had once felt fragile, and marveled at how far she had traveled, not just across cities, but through herself, discovering strength she hadn't known she possessed. "We built our life," she whispered back, not just a statement, but a mantra, a claim, a promise to herself that no one else could ever rewrite her story. Outside, the snow continued to fall, indifferent, beautiful, infinite, a quiet witness to survival, to growth, and to the unshakable truth that she was finally free. Audrey leaned her head against Patrick's shoulder, and in that unassuming, tender moment, she realized that the sweetest victory was not proving them wrong, not seeing their astonishment or discomfort, but simply living a life of authenticity, courage, and love unburdened by anyone's expectations but her own. And for the first time in a long while, she felt the world was entirely hers. Have you ever been underestimated, betrayed, or dismissed by someone you loved? This is a story about rising above heartbreak, reclaiming your life, and proving that your worth is never defined by anyone else. Watch how Audrey transforms pain into power, turning betrayal into her greatest triumph. Double tap if you believe in rising stronger than ever and comment below, what's the moment that made you realize your strength?